12:02. Let's get this party started. All right. First off, welcome for y'all coming over here to this Tech Talk series provided by Stratodesk here. We have Emanuel on there. He is the other floating head with me out here today. And our conversation today is deciding the future of work and kind of going over the Windows versus Linux debate and some of the things to remember. So I'm Patrick Coble. I'm the VDI hacker. I do stuff at VDISEC. So we focus on VDI security and privacy. Emanuel, you want to do your intro because you're, big boss man CEO, fun stuff, right?
Yeah, so my name is Emanuel Pirker. I'm the founder and CEO of Stratodesk. I'm a software engineer by profession, so software engineer turned entrepreneur. I'm kind of a strange animal when it comes to that kind of discussion, because obviously Stratodesk has a Linux-based product, but we are, if you think about it, we are in the business of delivering Windows and giving people a better experience in the way they consume Windows. So this is why this is really interesting, to think about how these two operating systems match up. Where would you want Windows? Where would you want a Linux-based product? So thank you very much, Patrick, for joining. It's really glad to have a well-known expert like you here. So I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Yep, I think we're going to have some fun for sure. All right, so let's get this party started with the first click here. So we're going to this is the basic agenda we're going to do. We've already done, introductions. We're going to talk about some of the key takeaways, some of the inherent security risk of just Windows, Windows vulnerabilities, kind of why Linux, open source, and what that means with security. And then what does an endpoint actually need, right? What does the worker actually need? So we're going to kind of dive into that. So, the biggest thing that we see, and especially with COVID, work from home and everything else, is which endpoint do you need? And what does your endpoint actually require when we send people home, along with when they're still at the office? And there's so many people using a VDI solution still, which is just kind of continually growing, and kind of go over that part of it. And the enterprise world we're trying to focus on in this kind of talk and discussion is just focus on the enterprise side, right? Windows is definitely the most prominent operating system in the enterprise space, endpoint space, right? We're going to get into servers and LAMP and Apache and things like that. Yeah, there's hundreds of millions of Linux things out there, but we're going to just focus on the endpoints. And then how do you, make up these two devices? And when we break them down and try to get it a little more simple, where we're not just saying like it's more secure, we're trying to give some quantitative stuff, which is definitely still subjective. This is not like, for everything. So we're just trying to find how they compare and contrast between each other, and especially in the challenging work environments. So kind of the first part here is, security risk when it comes to Windows, right? So Windows, from what I see, in most cases, if you do a straight install of Windows versus a straight install of Linux, there is a big port difference between those two, right? Of how many ports are open by default. Whereas Linux, depending on the distro, which is probably the other angle of this, is there's so many distros, it can have a lot less ports open. What do you think on this, Emanuel?
Yes. So in terms of that, sometimes people have this notion of Linux being very fragmented, because there is not just one Linux. There is Red Hat Linux, there is Ubuntu Linux, there is Debian Linux. And if from my perspective, our Stratodesk No-Touch OS is also a different Linux distribution. So in this case, the fragmentation works actually in our benefit, because it's very difficult to run something or to write some malicious piece of code that runs on everything or connects to everything. Nevertheless, what it means is I don't really like a generic statement, and this is why we have this talk. We don't want to make a blanket statement like saying Linux is more secure than Windows, right? Everyone would challenge that, and I challenge it too. Even as a lifelong fan of Linux, I would say we cannot simply drill down and say Linux is inherently more secure. We have to really look at what kind of Linux are we using? Are we using a desktop distribution? Are we using a specialized endpoint distribution? Are we using a server operating system? Exactly as you said, it depends on what you are actually using. However, what you have on this slide, this is a perfect statement that says the minimal footprint enables it to protect against most security threats, right? Because Windows is always Windows. It's a huge thing. Yeah, you don't know what is in there. At least you know it is a lot. Whereas with Linux, you know exactly these are my components, or we can, as the ones making such a Linux distribution, we can actually package it up nicely and say, oh, this is something we don't really need, so let's remove it.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's a good point. When we talk about how many more Linux flavors there are in the world, but the one difference that I think is in that second line, it's minimal footprint. So there's so many secure, hardened, minimal install versions of Linux versus Windows, say 10, 11, or server. All we have is server core. So if you don't go turn off services, then they're always on, right? So the Xbox service is running on your Windows 11 right now, unless you turn it off. So that's just one more port, one more daemon, one more line of code that's answering something, which we most likely don't need. And so that is one of the powers of Linux overall, is being able to have a minimal install that just has what you need. And it barely just has KDE and a GUI, or doesn't even have a GUI, right? Like a core operating system on the Windows side. So I think it's real important to understand that, there's just not a lot of hardened, secure Windows versions that you can just next. Whereas Linux, there are lots of them, right? Which is a benefit. It's a pro and a con at the same time, because you've got to find the right flavor of Linux, the right package that has the packages you need based on whatever you're doing for your job, or even on the server side too, right? This is going a little bit outside of just endpoints, but I think it's important to kind of yap about.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, thinking about this, we are often confronted with requests from customers who are saying, I want you to integrate that kind of third-party software. And certainly we help people make that work. We have plugin interfaces, but due to the minimal nature of say, NoTouch or any other hardened Linux, this sometimes means you have to install a third-party library. That means you get into this point of curating. And in our case, you cannot simply, when something is rolled out, you cannot simply install a library, right, for security reasons. Yep. It means you are curating this, and the same thing applies to security, right? If somebody wants to run some bad malicious code, they might simply find out we don't have the right version of libboost installed because we don't need it. Yeah, it's a C++ thing that most people like, but if we don't need that specific subversion of libboost, we don't have it. So that means there is an effort, and in this case, this works to our advantage. Now, one more thing, speaking about security risks in Windows. So I looked that up, and I think this is the number from 2020. So Patrick, correct me if I'm wrong, but in 2020, Windows had 907 vulnerabilities, and out of them, 132 were classified as critical.
Right, remote code. Yep, remote code.
132. I mean,
yep.
This is almost 3 of these a week. Yep. And this is critical, right?
Yep.
This is crazy.
Yeah. And I mean, if we look back just 2 weeks ago, some of the malicious documents using the Microsoft support reporting tool, right? MSDT and all that. So there's ways that you can send a malicious document to a Windows system, not to a Linux system, and be able to execute PowerShell code just by looking or opening the document, and it's not going to have any macro warnings. So it's kind of a new way of breaking into things. And I think when we talked about this overall too, is, there's so many Linux packages that are associated with the kernel and that go outside the kernel and supporting packages, the libs and everything else that we talked about. But then so many of those get updated independently of the operating system. And in some cases, they're not waiting for Patch Tuesday in that sense too. They're constantly going. And that's where, the apt-get, apt-install of a regular Linux system is there versus what y'all do, which is curate it, because your Linux distro is exactly what you need, nothing more, nothing less. And then that this dependency is for this library, and that library is connected to this daemon, and this daemon is updated here. So when we update this, we have to update that. We have to update that. So, with those types of vulnerabilities and remote code executions that come out, I mean, it keeps everybody in the operating system IT world busy all the time, because it's nonstop. There's something coming out. You can't wait. That's the biggest mistake that I've seen from so many people in every industry, is that Patch Tuesday comes, which is our chance to do something, and they wait weeks or months. And in those weeks or months, that's when you have the highest risk of ending up on the news, right? When those exploits are getting used out in the wild and you're the unpatched person, you have now, trying to find the needle in the haystack isn't hard when you have a magnet, right? And so when you drag the magnet through the haystack, you're going to find every single needle. And that's the same thing that happens when you don't patch those systems. And that's any operating system. But, to your point, there's lots of Windows critical things that come out that we all have to be mindful of, is the, IT nerd all over the place.
Yes. And these are only the ones we know about. Right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if we wouldn't have had WikiLeaks, we would have never known about Eternal Blue, right? And what the NSA and CIA had, where they had an exploit that had remote code execution, and they weren't telling anybody until WikiLeaks leaked it. And then they said, oh, yeah, that's a real exploit. Then Microsoft fixed it. So there's nation state actors and intel organizations that are, and obviously criminal enterprises that are going to have vulnerabilities, quote, 0 days, that they're just sitting on and using, right? And they're not going to tell anyone unless they absolutely have to. And that goes back to so much stuff has changed in the bug bounty programs too, where a lot of people aren't getting paid what they feel. And it's kind of Jedi-like going to the dark side, right? Because you can make a lot more money that way.
Yes.
So this was our next thing anyway, of talking about in the enterprise world, since it's so dominant, it's, Linux is definitely capable of being exploited, but its inherent minimal infrastructure makes it a little more challenging to do. So it's not impossible, because there's vulnerabilities for all those little packages all the time. I would say, like, me and you've talked about this before too, is like Log4j is probably the great equalizer of all vulnerabilities in the past 10 years that affected all systems, Windows and non-Windows, and even hardened appliances. So I know y'all jumped on Log4j pretty quickly and, got out there ahead of it, talked about it, fixed it, did your updates, do all that kind of stuff. But then it's, some other places were weeks and months, and some were almost a whole calendar year before they said, oh, hey, yeah, we did have a vulnerability.
Yes, and some people didn't even know they have it. Somebody introduced this maybe 10 years ago, then left the company. The code was still running on some servers. So Log4j was crazy. Yeah, as you said. So for us, this was really like electrifying. I remember the moment I got this message from a coworker, and he said Log4Shell, and this alone was already enough, because I mean, I'm not working with Log4j daily, right? But somehow it was in the back of my head. I saw Log4Shell, and I'm like, we need to do something. This doesn't sound good.
Yeah.
And I mean, fortunately, the way things are configured with, in our case, specifically with that specific JDK version, actually the really bad portion, the RCE, would not have worked. I mean, the LDAP lookup, yes, but the RCE so would not have worked. But nevertheless, there's no way you can leave something like this out. You patch it immediately, you throw this out, inform everyone and say, look, you update now. And if you don't update, I drive to your place and right. Yeah. Whatever it takes, we need to get this out.
Well, and I mean, that was the part that was kind of hard too, is like using Log4j as an example for that, is they had to patch it twice as a company, as an open source thing, right? Their first fix wasn't a fix forever, right? So they immediately had to do that. So you had a lot of companies like say, yes, we're vulnerable, we just fixed it. And then a week later, like, oh, we just refixed it, because they had to go back and re-update all those libraries for it. So, and I don't ever want to be like the cybersecurity doom naysayer kind of thing, but these things are going to continue to happen, right? We are, as a human species, we are maintaining billions of lines of code that run our everyday lives. Every daemon, every operating system, every program out there, from even the TCP stacks and stuff like that, and our CPUs themselves can be weaponized against us, right? When we think about all the things with Spectre and Meltdown and the CPU side, no one had ever really thought of that as an attack avenue before. And now that is definitely still the golden goose, because if we think about so many workloads are being virtualized, that is the creme de la creme. That's like the top shelf exploit. If you can run something on a VM and see what another VM is doing and collect information on it, and or push code and execute, you're living the dream, and can do a lot of bad things because of that. And so it's just going to continually keep going, and we all have to, I guess, do better of patching. And I think the biggest thing that I found, I had a client that had about 2,000 computers. We ran a Log4j scan using one of the CISA scanners, which basically just crawls around the file system and looks on Windows systems for a Log4j folder or Log4j mentioned. And in their world, they had a couple hundred systems. And when we went back and we were looking at that list, it was over 10% of their systems overall had some Log4j on it. And they only knew about 2 or 3% of that. And it's because no one had that good kind of software inventory that said, these are the pieces of software you use, these are the servers they're on, but that next level, these services use these libraries, these other programs, right? It's kind of that whole SolarWinds attack chain and supply chain stuff, right? So it's getting a lot more complicated, that's for sure.
Yeah. So if we take Log4j as sort of the one really critical and ugly thing that affected Linux servers, or basically anything that runs Java, yeah, but I know this was very popular. Not endpoints though, so at least we don't run Java Log4j on the endpoints, but on the servers. That is really critical. How do you say, does this compare to these 132 critical Windows security things that we see per year? Is it way more critical, overcritical, hypercritical, or is this kind of the same level of criticality?
I think it depends on what the server was, right? If we think about some of those critical vulnerabilities on the Windows side, the goal of that is to gain domain administrator and from there take over the Active Directory domain. Some of those vulnerabilities were directly related to domain controllers, right? Print Nightmare and a couple others. And so sometimes our old best practices are what led us down that path, right? For a long time, it was like, oh yeah, you can make your domain controller print server. Well, then when Print Nightmare came out and it was something related to the print spooler, oh, okay, well, that shouldn't be too big of a deal. Who uses, print spooler? Who has print spooler on domain controller? And then everyone did a quick self audit and like, yeah, we have in place upgraded the server since server 2008. So print server is running and it's hanging out there. And so these defaults that we thought were off because we're on server 2016, 2019 were not the case. And,
Okay.
And so a lot of that stuff goes there. And so when I think about Log4j, I think it was a better data hunt and it was a better application hunt for attackers. Because in one case, on the attack side, we know that most people are going to have Microsoft Windows, right? So if we have a Windows vulnerability, we have a high likelihood of using it. Well, this Log4j was kind of the great equalizer. There was all kinds of server operating systems, EMRs, CRMs, and other things that were related to it. They were using Log4j as their logging component of a bigger suite of applications. And so with that, it was an execution point that it reminded me of, kind of like, speaking of the Citrix world, of the whole Citrix ADC thing, where the Log4j and the Citrix ADC bug of 2019, both of those were like crazy times. But the Log4j was so huge that it gave it so many more possibilities. So I think it was probably worse as one single instance than many of the other Active Directory Windows vulnerabilities, but guaranteed a lot of those other Windows vulnerabilities got exploited. I think the time window in some of the Windows vulnerabilities for many organizations is a lot smaller. Log4j for some of those companies took January, February, March, April before they had patches or workarounds or even knew it. So you had multiple months of attacking, whereas hopefully most people are at least patching once a month, and we only had a 1 month gap of risk, depending on when we patch those things.
Yeah, but even 1 month sounds very scary.
It does, yeah. It's, 28 to 31 days of fun that can be had on your system.
So one kind of personal note, I live in California and have been doing so for a long time, but I was born in Austria, and believe it or not, that province or county or whatever it is, we don't have states like in the US. That government entity was hit by ransomware 2 weeks ago. They had to shut down everything. If I lived there today, for example, I would not be able to get a passport. The whole local government has shut down all their services, and so potentially data is leaking out. So we just don't know. And I guess these poor people, now everyone is pointing fingers at these IT people. I can only imagine these are kind of overworked IT people. I'm sure they had followed their best practices, but nevertheless, somebody got through, some hacker group, and all their computers were encrypted, ransomware attack. Yep. And they have to restore from really old backups or whatever they are doing now. But at least the whole government had to shut down. It's crazy.
And I think we're gonna, kind of the doom and gloom part of it is we're going to continue to see stuff like that, right? If we think about it in the United States, just being like, Southern boy down here, right? You got 50 states, almost each state has anywhere from like 60 to, 80 counties within it. And then inside those counties, there's, 5 to 50 cities in each one of those counties. So we're talking about 100,000 plus government entities, state, local government entities that are in charge of that sheriff department, that courthouse, that water supply, water treatment plant. There's about 100,000 of those. And when we see attacks that were very successful, ransomware, it really puts it to heart. And we talk about, there's tens of thousands of hospitals. There's, 50,000 plus schools and those different school systems. And to your point, it's just a lot of cases. Some of those is it's one IT person for 10,000 workstations and servers. So the ratio gets so far off that you are truly, in some cases, in those kind of government organizations, you're just fighting fires all day long, and you're not able to, progress to make any progress on lots of other things that you may even know about and know that, yes, it's bad. But if someone keeps calling your phone and saying, and I can't print here, this computer's not working, I need application X installed, that's all you do all day. And you don't get to go, oh yeah, let's scan the whole network to find what else is using Log4j. We don't even have time for error. And with some of the attacks like that, Oldsmore, Florida, that's the one that hits close to me, because if that person that would have done that attack would have just waited about 15 minutes, they could have poisoned 20,000 plus people and probably killed some people by using remote viewer and being able to execute some code to change some dilutions and poison the water. And so I think there's going to be more ransomware attacks and more data exfiltration and things like that that are just going to keep compounding this problem, which, this whole talk's kind of centered around the endpoints. And that's where, if you're using, in my opinion, if you're using like a Windows endpoint to just connect to a Windows virtual desktop, this is why Linux starts making a lot more sense, because we can reduce the attack surface on the endpoint and still have the same attack surface in the virtual desktop. Windows is still Windows, it's still in your data center, but the difference with it in your data center versus in your house and on that Wi-Fi is that in the data center, I can have ACLs and firewall rules and application protection, SIMs, and all these things. Whereas when it's a work from home deployment, I might not have those capabilities with my Windows system to do that. And so that's what comes to kind of even this next slide, is how Linux can be a little bit more bite-sized with the components you need. And that definitely falls into the Stratodesk bucket that we've talked about a little bit.
Yes. So see, this whole Windows in work from home, or Windows and work from home, I mean, this is something that makes me shiver. Yep. I mean, imagine you are a CIO and you have, I don't know, 100, 1,000 or 10,000, 100,000 workers out there, and they are all connecting from their homes. You have no idea what is in their Wi-Fi, how many guests they have in their Wi-Fi. It might be harmless, but still very capable, like teenagers who are capable. They might not be after your data. They will probably not do ransomware, but still, I mean, it's a way of entry. We have, I mean, we already talked about this one time. So smart home. So this is something that gives me nightmares. So I personally, I don't run IP-based smart bulbs or IP-based switches. I have all my smart bulbs and switches are on Z-Wave, which is a local radio standard. The hub for this is my own Raspberry Pi running Linux, of course. But, people are buying these things. I don't want to say the names, but, it doesn't matter. Your TP-Link, Kazaa, Wemo, they are great devices, but they have IP addresses. They are in your network. They have small microprocessors that can do certain things. How many of these are already weaponized? And how many of these are just waiting from a signal from some command and control server to start hacking or searching for Windows machines in your home network?
Totally. Well, and I mean, some of the largest denial service attacks into the terabits per second were from video cameras, right? Were from thermostats, were from other smart home things, to your point, that are connected to that network. And if you're a betting man, you're going to definitely assume that there's going to be some items in your house and houses across the US and the world that are already compromised, to your point, and they're just waiting for the right person to pay them enough Bitcoin to crank it up and point it at whatever government, company, individual, whatever, to start denial of service, to start exploiting, to start going from the local network, finding all Windows systems and saying, oh, okay, cool. So I think that local endpoint, when, and this is what I've seen since COVID too, is endpoints, especially on the Windows side, they had WSUS configured, but when they went home, WSUS doesn't work anymore, right? When they sent that computer home. And then when they had SCCM set up at some deployments, SCCM doesn't work unless they're connected to the VPN and does all this. So if they're connecting over VDI, I've seen computers even now over the past couple of weeks, I've seen computers that haven't been updated in 400 to 600 days. Wow. And it's because it's when they left for COVID, that March, April, May, nothing's happened since then. And that these computers are still working, right? They're still able to access the things they need to do, but the risk level of all these endpoints is just increasing, because there's people, when they sent people home, it was like we've talked about before, kind of 2 weeks to flatten the curve. That's all we thought, right? Like, oh yeah, we'll get them back next month, or, and then we'll get them all patched up. So a lot of organizations that sent home tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of endpoints did not have a plan of how they were going to do those Windows updates at month 2 or month 3 when we were still working from home. And now here we are on month, 28, something like that. It's like it's been 2 years and some change now. So I think that was a big one. And whatever your endpoint is knowing, do you need that much endpoint? And that's where that hybrid work world, really Linux starts shining as that endpoint.
Yes. So again, picturing myself as a CIO, I would definitely want to make sure that my users are connecting from a home system that has no open ports. So the smart bulbs can do whatever they want. I want it to be patched in the sense that there is a vendor with a specific update procedure that does not need a VPN or anything. I want it to be as minimal as possible. Certainly there are different attack vectors, right? It could be through a malicious USB stick or something. You don't know. It's not just the ports in the network. So we want it to be absolutely minimal, hardened, and really purposely built for that one job, which is either run a secure browser or connect to my company's VDI. I mean, speaking about VPN, I just had this conversation yesterday with an analyst from one of these well-known analyst firms, and what he said is, this is crazy. He said, people were looking and finding IoT deployments in their core network. How did this get there? Nobody installed a smart bulb in our core network, and they found out, because some VPNs were configured to simply bridge users' home devices into their network. I mean, I was like, hey, this is crazy. And obviously everyone will say, but you don't configure your VPN that way, right? But it happens.
Yes.
And so I'm definitely, I don't want to get into the discussion of VPN, yes or no, because this is almost like a religion. But at least I would say, make sure your workplace works with whatever kind of minimal connection to VDI, let's put it that way, minimal connection to VDI. Don't require anything like for example, what you were saying, for the updates to work, people would have had to open up the VPN. They did not. So this is really a catch-22. With VPN, I have my smart home devices in my corporate user smart home devices in corporate network without my machines are not updated. So this is certainly something where I now can say, wonderful, I feel good about Linux, specifically like what we do, no touch OS, purpose built. We don't get you in that catch-22, right?
Right. Yeah, for sure. And I mean, and this goes back to, this next slide here on open source and security is the dovetail. The more eyes you can have on the technology, the better chance that you have to spot something and also fix something rapidly too, right? Where something doesn't have to wait months. Some of these updates and packages and libraries and Linux operating systems can be updated multiple times per month as bugs are found and feature enhancements. So that open source really helps out. Windows has an army of people looking at those lines of code and doing those bug fixes and trying to do the feature enhancements too. But in some cases, I think, when sometimes that commercialization of that software, the priority becomes feature enhancements and not as much bug fixes, right? Because that's what's going to get everyone to Windows 11, right? Like a new start menu, a new UI, a new this. And then some of the old stuff that it was built on is like, okay, well, we'll get to it. If we see a CVE and someone reports it, we'll try to fix it and do the bug fixes or whatever level of exploit it is. But I think this is where open source can have like a slight advantage depending on the package, the product, the operating system, because there's more eyes on it. Now there is that extra risk because we've seen that in some protestware is what you would call it, right? Where some people were weaponizing some GitHub projects to block Russian IPs or Ukrainian IPs with that conflict going on and updating those packages all over the world. And it's like, okay, well, then it's like almost too open source where someone's able to do something like that and there wasn't enough checks and balances to catch it, along with packages and projects on GitHub just being orphaned, and someone just comes in and swoops in and gets that name and then starts updating packages and making their own playlist. So there's lots of pros and cons here, but I think the open source and security, Linux can have a slight advantage based on the number of eyes in specific situations. Over
Yes, and I think the good thing, or one additional point to that, is that as an end customer or an end user, you are not going directly on GitHub, right? You rely on a vendor that is curating things. Here we are again on this curating thing. Obviously, a vendor might do a good job or a bad job. So, but at least your due diligence as an end customer is more like selecting the right vendor, as opposed to going to GitHub and see, this is an orphan project. Oh, suddenly it got used again or changed again, then maybe by one of these actors. So you don't need to do this yourself.
Yeah. And I think this is important to know. It goes back to a previous point we talked about, is knowing what the software you're using is built from. Some of those packages, those names, because those are things you as an IT organization need to pay attention to, right? Now, after Log4j had that vulnerability, if anything ever spikes again, a lot of companies are going to be a lot more prepared to know what to do, because now they know this EMR system uses Log4j. vCenter was using this server was using that server was using this. So I think that part's good, but that's why you've got to know a little bit of the ingredients that are a part of your solution. From you've got Microsoft Active Directory, Server 2022, Windows 11, you're living the dream, but you still have application A, B, C, and D that require database server A, B, and C, and web server A, B, C. And you've got IIS, and you've got LAMP, and you've got all these other things that you need to know what makes up those, right? So that you have a better chance, because Log4j was also a good example of people didn't know what things were made out of, and even the vendors didn't know either, right? Which is why it took months in some cases for that to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, so the software bill of materials is definitely
exactly
important.
Yep.
So I remember we had this conversation earlier, right? And you advised us also to put this out as easily accessible as possible, even public. I mean, imagine some CIO gets this message on the text message on the phone, waking up, CEO texting you, hey, there is a security leak in the news. Are we affected? So we want to make it as easy as possible for the person potentially from the phone, not having to log into some customer portal or anything, just on the phone, see, okay, I'm a Stratodesk user, bill of materials, Stratodesk release notes, is this there? Do we have that version? We want to make it as easily as possible, potentially while the CIO is still in bed, so they can text back the CEO and say, no, we are not affected.
Yeah. Our package version is this, and the effective package is that. So we're already good. Oh, sweet. Cool. Yeah. You can stay in your jammies when those emergency requests come in, and through the power of the internets, you can find out if you're affected or not very quickly. So we talked about this probably 3 or 4 times, is knowing what your endpoints are doing. Are they just connecting to VDI? Do they need local applications? And this is where, in some scenarios, it could be we're prudent to run Windows, but then managing those windows, especially work from home, creates some new challenges that didn't exist when everybody was in the office together and there were stacked switches and thousands of computers on the 3rd floor and the 4th floor. It was all good. So I think this is an important thing, is knowing what your users need, what those endpoints need, to try to find out, could we replace them with a thin client operating system? Should we keep them Windows? Do we have to keep them Windows? And if they are Windows and now they're working from home, how are we going to patch them and update them and protect them, AV, SIM, all those types of things?
Yeah. So what I received different questions, not directly about security, but some customers were saying we actually want to put that Stratodesk Notage on a USB stick, and we advise our end users to simply hit F12 or F2 on their own machines. And this is not so much, they didn't do this so much for security, but more like for liability reasons, because they didn't want to get into the thing of installing company software on the local user-owned Windows. Now, I haven't really heard of a lawsuit where, say, somebody claims that a company software destroyed his Windows or took data, but the fact that I haven't heard about it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Maybe they settled with NDAs or whatever. But why this is still related to security in a BYOD world, I don't know if I would be comfortable installing company stuff on my own private machine.
Oh yeah, I think more and more people have become a lot mindful. I've been to a lot of Intune rollouts and AirWatch rollouts on especially the mobile device side, and people are really starting to question and understand, especially with iOS and Android, both modern operating systems on those phones. Every time any application asks for something, it will tell you like it needs access to the camera, it wants access to Bluetooth, it wants access to your local network, wants access to your photos. You have to hit allow or deny or always or only when using app. So I think people have become a little bit more security conscious. And when someone says you need to install a piece of software on your computer, like your computer or your phone, people are going, well, what can it do? What does it have access to? So I've seen some MDM rollouts that like kind of completely failed because everybody was like, no, you just need to buy me another phone. You're not putting your stuff on here because someone could wipe my device. And I've got my kids' photos and text messages with my family and doing all this and mail and shopping or whatever, because the phone is the center of most people's world in many cases. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it's constantly changing right now.
And especially with now remote work requiring, Zoom, Teams, and everything, that means your local computer, you grant microphone and camera access. And I personally feel way more comfortable if I use this with some Linux, hardened Linux that's on a USB stick. I know when I unplug it, it's gone. I would not want a company app, even if it is a well-known like Zoom, if it's somehow managed or controlled by my employer, and I granted access to the local camera. No, honestly, I would have a bad feeling. Now, so we don't do this at Stratodesk, right? We don't install anything on. We don't force anyone to install something. And as the founder, I kind of own my laptop anyway. But if I picture myself working in that situation, no, honestly, I would have an issue with that.
Yep. Yeah.
So that's very interesting, especially when it comes to camera and microphone. I mean, camera, at least, you can cover it, but how do you cover a microphone?
Yeah, and that's where those microphone locks kind of come into play, which is those little 3.5 millimeter jacks or USB ports that you plug into your computer or your mobile device, Lightning, USB-C, and then it makes the device think it has a microphone, but it doesn't. It's just a ground wire, right? It's not doing anything. Because I mean, there's been lots of extortion related things on endpoints because someone was able to run an exploit on someone's computer and then gain access to the webcam or the audio, right? And then, you basically think of it, that's Alexa gone wrong, right? Is in the Internet of Things, is if someone has access to that.
True.
And I think, we're wrapping up. So if anyone has any questions, I know we've kind of we've done a whole lot in the past, 44 minutes since we started. But if anyone has any questions, please type them in there. You can message them directly to me or Emanuel, or just send them to everybody. It's fine too in the chat. But I mean, I guess my closing thoughts, while everyone might be typing away right now, is think about your endpoints. Endpoints are very important. It's where the code execution is going to happen for most attacks and most applications that people are going to use. So what does the user need, and what can we do to give them what they need? Whether that's a thin client, a Windows operating system, this version of Windows, or these group policies, like let's turn these things on so that someone can't log on and use SMB version 1, 2, or 3, right? And they have to be using this version of Kerberos and NTLM v2 and stuff like that. So there's lots of things that you need to do on endpoints, and the operating system is a big deal, and there's big differences between Linux and Windows. Both have their pros and cons. In some cases, I think they can kind of wash themselves out with their risk. But I do love the ability in Linux to be able to make a purpose-built operating system with only what I need, versus a Windows operating system that just has regular flavor and core on the server operating system, but my Windows 11 desktop still is running Xbox stuff, right? And comes with Candy Crush and other integrated apps,
And I think security, or specifically hacking, has something to do with jumping from one thing to another. One specific security hole alone might not be attack vector enough, but the combination of multiple is what enables me to take over a complete company or a county's or anyone's IT system. So what this means, if I just take a step back, I mean, obviously I will try to fix everything I can, because the fewer puzzle pieces are available, right, the less chances of getting at least something together that matches. But the second thing is also, I will try to make sure people cannot jump from one system to another.
Yep.
And this is where the curated, minimal, highly secure Linux endpoint comes into play, because this is exactly with VDI as a whole, or be it browser based, but just make sure people don't get direct access into the corporate network. So I guess the worst thing is really to open up the VPN that bridges the network. Sort of, you run Microsoft Word at home, connecting to the file server that is physically in Office. So meaning direct IP connectivity that, I don't think people are doing that unless it happens. But this would certainly be the worst. So try to separate network spheres, domains, however you might call it, try to separate as much as possible to make sure people cannot jump and escalate and elevate, right? Because one system might have that security hole where you can at least log in, but you cannot get root. But from that system, you can jump to something else, and there you get the admin rights, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep. No, agreed. I mean, that pivot is the point, right? Usually it's not one exploit that brings down everything. Now, have been some cases, and even reported cases, where it was literally one exploit that was executed that then gained access to all the things because of that. But usually you've got to do a little bit of Frogger. You've got to hop, skip, and jump between systems to gather. And each one of those things needs to be unpatched or vulnerable, whether that's vulnerable because it's not patched or vulnerable because it has a weak configuration, right? And has stuff that shouldn't be installed. So yeah, it's a big one. We got a good question here. And I know I've been dealing with this even in the Mac world, is Microsoft Teams and using webcams and microphones on Linux, and the differences of how Microsoft Teams works on a Windows operating system, a Mac operating system, which I think is kind of in the middle ground, and then the Linux operating systems at the end. But VDI, in many cases with Horizon and Citrix, can bridge that gap as long as you can map that USB device over. So that in VDI, Teams can work semi-natively and still be a decent work from home experience. So I know y'all have done a lot of Microsoft Teams work too, right? I mean, because it's this whole work from home and chatting and collaboration platform has just grown this whole industry.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's that I think you can get near native experience now is the best thing I can say, even on a Linux endpoint or a Linux endpoint being connected to VDI for sure. Right. Because then it's still the Windows version of Teams using those USB redirections of your microphone or camera.
So the way these Teams optimizations work is that the VDI kind of separates the screen, yeah, and you sort of in the basic ICA protocol stream, you get a black rectangle, and this will then filled in locally with the locally decoded video to give you that. So kind of what you want to avoid is, you know, to have this screen on the server-side desktop where the system is decoding the compressed video stream, and then you are re-encoding the whole thing as whatever ICA or just H.264 deep encoder, so that it comes to you. You want to avoid that, and this is the basic principle how all these early multimedia forwarding up to Teams forwarding work. And obviously it also wants to make sure that your audio is uploaded in the best available codec. And you know, sometimes these speech codecs are they are not royalty free, so somebody needs to pay for that. So this is a good way for say a company like Citrix to say, I cannot speak for Citrix, I don't know what they use, but to say, okay, we get the rights for that codec, then we have something that nobody else has. We have a better way of uploading the user's audio, because a raw uncompressed audio is pretty intense in terms of bandwidth requirements and of course latency requirements, right? You need to make sure that the one thing you learn about multimedia is, or the very basic thing is, visible frames can drop. This is not annoying, but the moment your audio crackles, your users are really, really annoyed.
Yep. And then when that audio and video sync starts going and getting tighter and longer, where as you're talking and it's not keeping up with the video or vice versa. But yeah, that audio, I mean, I guess since VDI's inception, that was one of its first use cases, was to be able to use like Cisco Jabber and things like that, to be able to be like, all right, instead of it being a RDS based server operating system that might have some kind of, you know, collaboration software, now we can run a desktop operating system that can have all that collaboration software, but then will it actually work? And that's where all those content redirections kind of save the day on being smarter, and how they channel things and how they display things was really cool. And it's been amazing to see how many times I've been able to do stuff in a virtual desktop that I'm still kind of amazed that they can do. You know, I worked on a flight simulator in the NVIDIA Quadro days in NVIDIA Grid, putting a flight simulator for a real big company in it. And it actually worked. And I was like, holy moly, you know, this is on like Windows 7. I was like, this is insane. And even as a nerd, it blows me away. And now what we can do now versus then is just crazy. So I know for me, I went to a company that was having a bunch of bandwidth problems in their VDI. And I don't know if you've heard about this one, but it's called wormmate.io. It's a little worms game. Like if you remember QBasic Nibbles, right?
Yeah.
Where you have your Nibbles game. Well, Wormmate is like a 3D one, and it's the HTML5 game. And they had problems because everyone was using that in a virtual desktop, and they were just playing inside that virtual desktop. And that thing is decently graphics intensive. And the CPUs were going through the roof, and the bandwidth was going through the roof. And they're like, what is going on? All we see is, you know, Google Chrome being launched. And then once we dug in with like, you know, solutions like Control Up, we were like, oh, there's where they're going. They're gaming all day. Oh, okay. All right. So let's block that from content control. And now no one can go play the worm game all day.
Cool. It is cool. Yeah.
Yeah. Has anyone got any other questions? Because I think we've covered a lot.
I have received another question. This is, does NoTouchOS provide for ongoing security updates with something analogous to apt and yum so that updates can happen without staging a new OS release? So the answer to that is not a simple yes, no question. So we have a mechanism to send out an incremental update to a client. So the way this works is because the basic operating system image is immutable. So you cannot change that. So even with root rights or administrator rights, root in our Linux terminology, you cannot simply add a file or change a file. And this is on purpose because we want it to be secure. We don't want people to locally, even administrators with good intentions, just go there and install something and then go somewhere else, install something else. So, but that of course means we cannot simply change the files, but we can do an overlay. So we can, on top of that file system, we can put on another layer that contains updated files. The practical answer, though, is that given the security implications of what we are doing, we do not have, like Windows, 3 critical security holes a week. So that means you are fine with our regular cadence of releases every couple of weeks. We provide an updated build that certainly pulls in all the upstream updates, like from the kernel. You don't have to update all the time, but you can if you really want to be on the latest. And with the image size, most customers are totally comfortable with that. And again, if not, if you really have this situation, or if we have this situation tomorrow that we need to exchange just one specific 20 kilobyte file, and we don't want to roll out the whole image, then we can do it with the overlay mechanism.
Right. And I mean, I think y'all have had a very regular tempo for a while. And then there's been a couple things that I think you've updated a little bit earlier than your regular tempo, but got it out to your clients. Because I know you always do a very good job of keeping like the Citrix Workspace app and Horizon client and AVD clients and things like that up to date all the time. And so those get packaged in, but then you're also always deploying the latest distros of some of those things too. So
yes,
it becomes a combo punch.
Yes, we pulled that in, yeah.
All right. I don't have any other questions. I mean, we're at the top of the hour.
Seems we made it exactly to the hour. Yeah, thank you, Patrick. It's always great talking to you. I don't know about people in the audience. How do you feel? Honestly, after such a talk, somehow I feel a bit depressed because the security thing, it is overwhelming. And I really, personally, I really have to focus on what I can do. Yes. Of course, in the product, but also in my home network, in the company network, what we can do. Just thinking about, these tens of thousands of government entities that are out there and their struggle and private companies that have our data and get hacked. To be honest, it makes me a bit depressed.
Yeah, I think I can always get that way because I see this all the time when I'm doing incident response and everything else. But then I go back to what you said originally when you first went down that part, is controlling what you can control, right? And doing what you can for your household, your family, right? And then where you work, and then for you, the product that you deliver to your customers too. And those rings of securing the things that you can control. And I think that's all you can do. And this is where the social media can help you and hurt you. Social media will sometimes, if you're following the right people on Twitter or whatever, you're going to learn about a vulnerability that may just be hot off the press, but that means you also have to spend time doing it and looking at it and paying attention to it. Or you just have to do regular updates and just turn things on automatic updates and trust that whole system from Windows to Linux to this operating system to NoTouchOS and some of the auto update settings that it has to let it take care of you and curate those things for you, you know?
True.
All right. Well, cool. Well, thank you
Wonderful.
all so much. And thank you, Manuel, for this. This was a fun talk and a good one. And I think it's very relevant for sure.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Patrick. Thanks for sharing your insights. This was very interesting. Thank you very much. And thanks everyone for joining and watching and listening in. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.